Late at night, behind locked doors at Windsor, whispers of a secret conclave erupted a decision that could change the monarchy forever. Who authorized it? And why Catherine? The air that evening clung heavy to the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, as though the stones themselves sensed the weight of what was to come. A tense quiet pervaded the halls, but it was not the serenity of royalty. No, this was the kind of silence that masks brewing storms. Hours earlier, staff exchanged uneasy glances when word trickled through the corridors Anne and Charles had been seen arguing, their voices raised enough to echo faintly through the tapestries. The whispers were urgent, clipped, and filled with words no one dared repeat aloud. In the Queen's private drawing room, the thick oak doors remained shut as faint murmurs slipped through the cracks. Those who passed by slowed instinctively, drawn to the sound of destiny being decided just beyond their reach. Staff spoke of hushed meetings held earlier that week between Anne and her brother that left both looking visibly shaken. No one seemed to know what had triggered the confrontation, but the topic was clear. The question of succession and whether tradition still had the final word. As darkness deepened over Windsor, mysterious black vehicles arrived one after another, their tinted windows and silent approach striking fear and curiosity into anyone who caught sight of them. Royal guards tightened their formation around the entrance, as if shielding the very future of the monarchy. Each car delivered someone important, someone whose presence could either fortify or fracture what little unity remained in the family. Then, she appeared. Catherine. Seen entering through a discreet side entrance, she moved with a quiet resolve. But her face betrayed her. She looked visibly shaken, yet impossibly composed, as though she had already glimpsed what awaited her behind those doors and accepted it, no matter the cost. The sight of her Catherine, the quiet force who had long stood in the shadows of others, sent a jolt through everyone who caught it. But the most electrifying moment came hours before the meeting even began, when a servant, scurrying past the Queen's antechamber, overheard a chilling declaration. Anne's voice, unflinching and sharp, cut through the murmur of the room. "She will lead." The words hung in the air, heavy with authority, refusing to be dismissed as mere opinion. It was not phrased as a question or a suggestion, but as a prophecy, a command. The staffer who heard it stood frozen for several moments before hurrying away, too fearful to linger but unable to shake the echo of Anne's voice from their mind. The phrase passed through the halls like wildfire, whispered in corners, embroidered into nervous glances, and carried down to even the lowest footman by the time the conclave began. But what unfolded behind those sealed oak doors would shake not just the royal household, but the nation itself. While Britain slept, a royal conclave convened at Windsor under strict silence, attendance so secret that even Camilla was left outside the chamber. Summoned without fanfare and bypassing the usual palace protocols, the Windsor Conclave began not with ceremony, but with shadows. The decision to gather was made within hours of Anne's whispered declaration that she will lead, yet no official notice was sent, no schedule printed. Invitations, if one could even call them that, were delivered verbally, each recipient summoned quietly to Windsor under the cover of darkness. The usual hierarchy of courtiers and secretaries was deliberately ignored, leaving many baffled and enraged as they learned too late what was unfolding inside the castle's oldest chamber. Those who entered the room that night formed a circle of power unlike any seen in recent royal memory. Anne, with a calm yet determined presence, sat at the head of the long oak table. To her right, King Charles lingered in tense silence, his fingers drumming faintly as though he, too, was unsure if he belonged here. Opposite Anne sat Catherine, her eyes low but unwavering, her hands folded tightly together in her lap as though to keep herself from trembling. Around them, 3 senior advisors whose names the palace never disclosed stood ready to take notes, their expressions unreadable. Camilla, however, was not among them. Though she arrived at the castle in haste after hearing whispers of what was underway, she was stopped at the door, her name not included on the list. What followed was described by those nearby as a furious scene. Camilla reportedly raised her voice so loud it echoed down the halls, accusing Anne of betrayal and Charles of cowardice. Her words were met with quiet defiance. The guards instructed firmly not to let her through, and so she remained outside, pacing and fuming, while the fate of the monarchy was debated within. At the center of the table lay an envelope sealed with the Queen's own insignia, one that Anne produced only after everyone was seated. The envelope, rumored for months to exist, had been kept under lock and key since the Queen's final days. Its contents, Anne hinted, would make clear what their mother truly intended for the future of the crown. For a long moment, no one moved, the weight of that promise pressing down on every pair of shoulders in the room. As the discussion began, Catherine sat opposite Anne, pale but resolute, every glance from the others drawn to her. She did not speak, but her silence was not weakness. It was anticipation, the stillness of someone who already understood that destiny was no longer waiting politely at her doorstep but demanding to be met head-on. Servants, sworn to silence under threat of dismissal, moved like ghosts, delivering drinks and retrieving documents without daring to look directly at the participants. Still, fragments of the conversation would later find their way beyond the chamber, carried by frightened whispers and half-heard sentences from those brave enough to linger just outside. And then Anne stood, breaking decades of silence with a proclamation that sent a shiver through the room. "She will lead!" Anne's voice rang out like a thunderclap, echoing in the stunned silence of the conclave. But what did she mean? For a moment, time seemed to halt. Every breath in the room froze as Anne rose from her chair with quiet determination and walked the length of the table. Without a word, she stopped behind Catherine, placed her hand firmly on her shoulder, and spoke again, this time slower, but just as commanding. "Catherine will lead us into the next era. Not as an ornament, not as a consort, as the monarch this family and this nation deserves." Her words struck the gathered advisors like a hammer blow. Heads turned. Quills paused mid-sentence. Even the faint sound of a clock ticking above the fireplace seemed to falter. King Charles shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though to steady himself. His eyes, reddened and wet, darted between Anne and Catherine, then back to the Queen's sealed envelope lying untouched in front of them. "But protocol," he muttered, the word trailing off into a whisper almost no one could hear. His voice carried both disbelief and fear, as if he could already sense the world he knew beginning to crack. Yet Anne did not flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze slicing through him. "Protocol," she declared coldly, "has been the prison that suffocated this family for decades. Mother knew it. You know it. And deep down, so does everyone in this room." Catherine remained seated, her cheeks flushing as the weight of Anne's words settled over her like a crown she hadn't asked for but could no longer refuse. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the sheer gravity of what Anne was demanding of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but found the words refused to come. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, trying to compose herself under the crushing expectation now resting squarely on her shoulders. Across the table, the advisors exchanged nervous glances, their pens hesitating before resuming their scribbles. Some looked relieved, others deeply unsettled. The silence in the room now carried an entirely different weight, not of confusion, but of inevitability. Catherine's name was being written into history in real time, each scratch of ink etching her closer to a destiny none of them dared to openly contest. Anne stood tall behind Catherine, her hand never leaving her shoulder, as if to say that no matter what resistance came next, she would not stand alone. The Queen's blessing had been invoked, and with it, a truth none of them could deny. Something monumental had just shifted, and there was no turning back. But if Anne's proclamation was shocking, the evidence she unveiled next would silence every doubt in the room. Anne reached into a velvet folder, pulling out a letter marked in the late Queen's hand. "For my children's eyes only. Inside lay the truth." The air in the room grew impossibly heavy as the seal was broken, a silence so profound it seemed to drown out even the ticking of the clock. Anne unfolded the note slowly, deliberately, as though she understood the power of what she held. The handwriting was unmistakable, Elizabeth's steady, elegant script, penned with the authority of a monarch who had endured crises far more devastating than any of them could imagine. Her words began not with formalities, but with a declaration that struck like a blade. "To those who remain, it is Catherine who carries the heart of the crown's future." The phrase ignited a hush so deep it bordered on reverence. The Queen, even in death, had spoken with clarity none of them could defy. Catherine's name was written there not as an afterthought, not buried in polite flattery, but placed squarely at the center of the page. Anne read on, her voice unwavering as she revealed line after line of Elizabeth's vision words that hinted she had foreseen the fractures threatening to split the family apart and had chosen Catherine to heal what decades of pride and ambition had broken. What was perhaps even more telling was what the letter did not say. Camilla's name never appeared. Not once. As Anne reached the final paragraph and folded the paper back into place, the omission hung in the air like a ghost. Those seated around the table exchanged glances. The realization settling over them like a shroud, Elizabeth's silence spoke louder than any condemnation could. The Queen had not merely passed her blessing to Catherine, she had deliberately passed over Camilla, leaving no room for interpretation. Anne revealed the date of the document months before the Queen's final illness, long before any of them suspected her end was near. The letter had been kept securely in Anne's private safe all this time, waiting for the moment she deemed it necessary to unseal it. It was clear now she had chosen her timing carefully, waiting for the family to be cornered by its own divisions before unveiling the late Queen's final command. Across the table, the advisors sat rigid, their pens hovering motionless above the pages, as though afraid even to write. The silence was broken only when Charles, staring down at the table, let out a strangled whisper, "Mother knew best." The words carried defeat, but also a quiet recognition that the decision had been made long before he ever thought to contest it. Catherine, her hands trembling, reached for the letter and clutched it to her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. It wasn't just a blessing she held, it was a burden, and she knew it. But not everyone was willing to accept the Queen's blessing, not by a long shot. As word of Anne's declaration reached Camilla outside the room, her fury erupted. She stormed in, demanding to know what treachery was afoot. The doors of the chamber swung open with a force that startled even the seasoned advisors. Camilla's voice arrived before she did, sharp and quivering with outrage, cutting through the heavy silence like shattered glass. "What is this?" she demanded, her tone dripping with venom. "What games are you playing, Anne? What lies have you fed them to push me aside?" Her eyes blazed with a mixture of fear and indignation, her breath ragged, as though the very foundation of her place had been ripped away without warning. Anne did not flinch. She stood tall, her hand still resting on Catherine's shoulder as if daring Camilla to dislodge it. Camilla advanced, her words growing more heated, each syllable flung like an accusation. "You've been planning this for years behind my back," she cried, her anger now laced with desperation. "You've manipulated everyone, even Charles, to make her into something she was never meant to be." The room vibrated with the weight of her accusations, but Anne's response came with an icy calm that silenced even the faint scribbling of the advisors. Without raising her voice, she turned to face Camilla fully, her expression hard and unyielding. "It was never yours to claim," she said, gesturing to the Queen's letter still clutched in Catherine's hands. "You knew it. We all knew it. You simply refused to see it." Her words hung in the air like a judgment handed down from above, final and unassailable. Charles, caught between his wife and his sister, stared at the table, his hands clasped tightly before him. His silence screamed louder than words ever could. To the advisors watching, his stillness carried an unspoken truth. His lack of protest was, in itself, an admission. And that quiet, that refusal to defend Camilla against the tidal force of Anne's resolve, was all the confirmation anyone needed that the decision had already been made, with or without his blessing. At the center of it all, Catherine remained seated, visibly overwhelmed but unshaken. Her knuckles whitened against the paper she gripped, her gaze fixed ahead. Though her breath quickened under the weight of the moment, she did not retreat. Her stillness became her strength, and even Camilla seemed to sense it. But the shouting grew louder, chaos threatening to overtake the room as the advisors stepped forward, attempting to calm the storm. Their voices layered into the clash like faint echoes, pleading for composure, urging restraint, trying in vain to keep the monarchy's secrets from spilling any further. But as the confrontation raged on, another voice, unexpected and authoritative, cut through the tension. At last, Charles rose, his hands trembling as he delivered a verdict that would define his reign and fracture his family. For a moment, even Camilla's furious words fell silent as all eyes turned to him. The weight of his silence until now had been deafening, but the sight of him standing visibly shaken yet resolute carried its own force. He pressed both palms against the table, his voice breaking through the tension like a confession that had been buried for decades. "I cannot deny what she wanted," he began, his tone heavy with weariness and quiet anger. Mother made her wishes clear, but to learn of this from my sister, in secret, without even a whisper beforehand, that cuts deeper than any of you could know." He glanced at Anne then, his expression torn between gratitude and betrayal. "You," he said, his voice cracking, "have robbed me of the chance to prepare my own heart for this moment." His admission hung in the air, thick with regret. But then, after a pause, he turned his gaze toward Catherine, and his words softened. "I knew," he continued, "I've always known you were the people's choice. Even as I tried to fight it, even as I clung to Camilla's dreams, I could see the truth written on every face in the crowd. It was never about me, or her. It was you, always you." The raw vulnerability in his eyes betrayed a lifetime of compromise. And finally, the dam broke. Tears streaked his cheeks as he reached out his hand toward Catherine and uttered the words that would change everything. "For the good of the crown, she will lead." The final syllable cracked, but its meaning was undeniable. Camilla gasped audibly, her face crumpling as though struck. She shook her head, choking back sobs, before turning on her heel and storming out of the room. The sound of her heels fading into the distance was punctuated by the faint catch of her voice as she muttered, "I'll never forgive this. Never." For a beat, silence followed her exit. Then the advisors stirred, pen to paper, recording the moment in the official record. Catherine's name, inked as designate, the next leader of the monarchy. The rustle of the pages seemed almost sacrilegious, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Catherine finally rose, her entire frame trembling as she looked at Charles. Without a word, she bowed deeply, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I will honor this, and you." The room remained spellbound, the tension thick with unspoken grief and reluctant acceptance. But even as the family fractured inside Windsor, the outside world was beginning to stir. Within hours, whispers from Windsor reached Fleet Street, and the world woke up to a headline no one expected: "She will lead." It began as a murmur, carried on the lips of a few bold staffers too stunned to keep silent, but by dawn, it had become a roar. The palace aides scrambled desperately to contain the leaks, frantically calling editors and pleading with journalists to hold their pens, but the dam had already burst. Reporters swarmed Windsor, their cameras raised and questions fired like bullets, determined to glimpse the woman who had just rewritten the monarchy's destiny. Social media lit up like wildfire, hashtags about Catherine's new title climbing to the top of trending lists within minutes. Some posts celebrated her as a savior of tradition, others painted her as a usurper. But the reaction was unified in one thing. Every corner of the internet pulsed with images of Catherine seated at the conclave table, her head bowed over the Queen's letter, and of Camilla, red-eyed and furious, retreating into the night. The frenzy reached its peak when paparazzi caught Camilla leaving Windsor in tears. The photos, splashed across every tabloid, painted her as defeated and dethroned, her exit framed by speculation that she had been publicly and irrevocably deposed. Headlines screamed betrayal. Whispers of exile began to swirl, and commentators on morning television openly wondered if she would ever return to the public eye. Outside the gates of Windsor, the public began to gather in growing numbers. By midday, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, holding hastily painted banners that read, "Our Queen, and she will lead." Their voices rose in chants that echoed through the ancient walls, an outpouring of support that even the most cynical advisors could not have foreseen. The chants grew louder each hour, a relentless drumbeat Catherine could no longer ignore. At last, she emerged onto the balcony to face them, flanked by Anne, whose stone-faced presence lent gravity to the moment. Catherine's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of her new role as she uttered the only words she could find. "I will serve with humility!" The crowd erupted in cheers, their faith in her solidified, their cries now one of triumph. Behind her, Anne remained still and proud, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though daring anyone to challenge what had been decided. But as the day drew to a close and the flashbulbs faded into the night, a question lingered behind the triumphant headlines, one that none of them dared yet answer. Yet behind the triumphant headlines lay a deeper question: what does "she will lead" truly mean for the future of the monarchy? Inside Windsor, advisors draft documents. Outside, crowds roar. But the real work of Catherine's leadership is only beginning. and the price remains unknown. The echo of chants still hung in the air as the palace's most trusted aides convened behind closed doors, their pens moving furiously to codify what had already been declared before the world. But with every stroke of ink, new questions emerged. Whispers of Catherine's new title stirred confusion even within these walls. Was she to reign as a co-monarch alongside Charles? Or had Anne carved out a wholly unprecedented role for her, a power surpassing even the crown's traditional reach? The ambiguity sparked heated debate. Each advisor spoke with caution, for they knew one careless phrase might set the monarchy ablaze from within. As documents were drafted, they carried an unspoken urgency to manage not just Catherine's ascension, but the nation's fragile expectations. Some warned of constitutional crises should the line of succession appear manipulated. Others feared public unrest if the announcement were mishandled. Yet every suggestion returned to the same unavoidable truth: there was no going back. Catherine had already been crowned in the hearts of the people, and the palace was now playing catch-up with history. Outside the palace gates, the jubilation grew, but beyond sight of the cameras, shadows lengthened. Camilla, humiliated and exhausted, reportedly fled to a private estate that afternoon, declining to speak even to Charles before she left. Her silence became its own statement. She would not contest the decision publicly, but neither would she bless it. Her retreat marked another fracture in the family that would not easily mend, her absence from the balcony conspicuous and unspoken. Amid the noise and the paperwork and the shifting alliances, Catherine slipped quietly into St. George's Chapel alone. Kneeling where so many before her had sought strength, she whispered a prayer no one else could hear, vowing to honor both Queen Elizabeth's vision and Charles's broken trust. Tears and determination mingled on her lips as she made her silent promise. She would carry them both, no matter how heavy the burden became. Later that evening, Anne found her standing alone outside the chapel. With a rare softness in her voice, she spoke words that Catherine would never forget. "The crown is heavier than you think." Those 7 words were both a warning and a blessing, a quiet acknowledgement that the road ahead would demand more than dignity and grace. It would demand everything. And so, as Windsor's ancient halls absorbed the roar of the crowds and the scratch of pens, winds of change swept through the royal family. Old loyalties crumbled, new alliances took root, and the fractures of past betrayals widened into uncharted chasms. Power had shifted irrevocably, but its cost had yet to be tallied. And as night fell once again over Windsor, one final revelation waited to surface, one that could either cement Catherine's place or shatter it completely. Just as Catherine began to grasp her destiny, a final document emerged from the Queen's archives, sealed tighter than all the rest, with a warning: "Open only if you dare." For a fleeting moment, the room believed the storm had passed, the decision made, the crown's future secured. But Anne, standing quietly at the edge of the chamber, knew otherwise. Without a word, she stepped forward and placed a second envelope on the table in front of Catherine. Its seal was darker, thicker, its edges worn with the weight of something that had clearly waited years to be revealed. She did not speak, nor did she explain. Her eyes met Catherine's briefly, and then she stepped back, her silence more eloquent than any explanation could have been. The advisors froze where they stood, instinctively sensing the air around them change. This was no ordinary document. Its presence alone carried an unspoken warning, as though even the Queen herself had doubted whether it should ever see the light of day. Catherine hesitated before picking it up, her fingers tracing the seal where the Queen's familiar hand had written, "For my successor's eyes only open only if you dare." With a quiet breath, she broke the wax. The pages inside were brief, but each word struck with the weight of a hammer. At first, her brow furrowed in confusion. Then her eyes widened in disbelief. And finally, her lips parted in a silent gasp. Whatever secrets lay in those lines reached far beyond her own fate, beyond even the family gathered around her. The contents were rumored to outline not just her role, but a revelation about the throne itself. A truth so devastating, it would not only upend her own claim, but call into question everything the crown stood upon. Catherine's hands began to tremble, the papers rattling softly as her breath quickened. Her face drained of color, her composure fraying as the full weight of what she now knew threatened to crush her entirely. Even Anne, unflinching until now, instinctively stepped back as if sensing the magnitude of what had been unleashed. The advisors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes averted, each of them silently acknowledging they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. For a long moment, Catherine said nothing. Her eyes scanned the final lines over and over as though searching for a way to make the words untrue. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke, "This changes everything." She folded the letter slowly, deliberately, and slipped it into her pocket. Straightening her back, she turned to the family and advisors, her gaze sharper, heavier now. The room fell silent under the weight of her resolve. Finally, she uttered the words that would echo through Windsor's walls and beyond. "We begin tomorrow." And so, in the silence of Windsor's ancient walls, the fate of Britain's monarchy hung by a thread, its next chapter poised to be written by Catherine's hand. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.